Kia ora, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, and raurangatira mā, nau mai, haere mai, whakatau mai, ki tēnei hui mariko. Ko Barry Coates aho, ko te kārahi o te patea whaiwhakaro. Nā reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Tihei moriora. So a very warm welcome to you all. I'm Barry Coates. I'm CEO for Mindful Money. This is the 12th in our current seminar series, and the seminars are held on Wednesdays at 12:15, and videos and podcasts of the previous seminars are available on Mindful Money's website, on YouTube and other websites. So go and have a look. I think there's some fabulous previous episodes, so feel free to go and have a look at those. The issue for today is global deforestation and the financial risks of environmental damage. So in order to start the seminar, we wanted to do a background on global deforestation and the drivers of deforestation. So here is an interview with Emma Thomson, lead author of the Forest 500 report, and Emma works for Global Canopy, a UK-based research institute. So here it is. My great pleasure to welcome Emma Thomson to join us. Emma works for Global Canopy in the UK. She's lead for their Forest 500 report. So thanks very much for joining us, Emma.
No, thank you for having me.
Emma, for the last 9 years, your report, the Forest 500, has tracked the policies and performance of the most influential companies and financial institutions linked to deforestation in their supply chains and investments. And I noticed in the last Forest 500 report, you said that 2023 is a watershed year for action on deforestation. So in addition, perhaps to give us a little bit more background about the Forest 500 report, can you also tell us why this year is so important?
Absolutely. So as you said, Forest 500 has been identifying the companies and the financial institutions that are the most exposed to the risk of deforestation. So these 350 companies and 150 financial institutions have the greatest influence in supply chains that are linked to deforestation. So that's specifically commodities like palm oil, soy, beef, leather, and timber and pulp and paper. And so these companies and financial institutions have the power to transform the supply chains of those commodities if they act on deforestation. And we've been assessing them every year for 9 years. And what we've unfortunately seen is that there is still too little progress on deforestation and the associated human rights abuses. And so 2023 has to be a watershed year for action on deforestation. We have to see this progress now. In the past few years, there's been a wealth of new data, new tools, new guidance that can help these companies and financial institutions address these issues effectively. And there was a COP26 where the Glasgow Declaration on Forests and Land Use was signed and agreed by over 100 countries. In late 2022, there was the Global Biodiversity Framework that was agreed. And recently we've just seen we'll soon see the introduction of legislation in the European Union that will require companies in deforestation risk supply chains to act on these issues. And so everything is there for these companies to act, and we need to see them do that.
That's really interesting. It is a confluence of those factors coming together, and we've seen the EU's regulation on deforestation, and potentially that could be a really important, in a way, instrument in order to embed deforestation into kind of company risks, investment risks, and hopefully significant change of behavior.
hopefully.
Emma, it's interesting, your analysis and the EU's regulations don't only focus on the companies causing the damage, but you're trying to get the major drivers of deforestation, aren't you? The kind of economic activities that drive deforestation. Is that correct?
Yes, so we tackle as an organisation the market forces that are destroying nature with a specific focus on companies and financial institutions.
And so kind of behind those companies is your listing of the 150 financial institutions that provide the money. Why are you this is a major part of your report, why is that linked with the funding so important in your analysis?
The finance sector and the financial institutions, so organisations like banks and pension funds and asset managers, they all have a very clear but slightly different connection to deforestation than the companies in those supply chains. But most of those companies require that financing from the banks, from asset managers and more to act and to operate in their supply chains. So through the financing that financial institutions provide, they can actually impose requirements or encourage these companies to act and improve their practices. So the finance sector is a really crucial role in eliminating deforestation because they can require companies to set policies requiring them to eliminate deforestation by 2025 and to address the associated human rights abuses, and then also check in on their progress towards that every year. And if that progress isn't seen, financial institutions can eventually withdraw finance from those companies. So it's a really strong
pressure for change. Yeah. So it's both divestment and engagement to improve performance. Are you finding that a lot of the funds that would see your analysis would just decide to divest because it's too risky and maybe they feel they don't have a lot of leverage over those companies through engagement? Is that a common reaction, or are most funds engaging with the companies?
I would say that most are engaging with the companies, which is exactly what we want them to do. For many financial institutions, if they withdraw financing today, the influence that they have through their relationship with that company ceases to exist. So by remaining invested in these companies and having that engagement, that open dialogue, these financial institutions can really drive that change. So we are seeing a lot really get stuck into that engagement and making sure it's aligned with best practice and taking action. But there are some that are still not wanting to commit to addressing deforestation because they think that it leads to that divestment immediately.
And so are you seeing companies changing as a result of this investor pressure? Are there some examples maybe of companies that are changing their practices because of investors, maybe other pressures as well?
We have seen a lot of progress from companies since we started the Forest 500 in 2014. So I would say roughly 2/3 of them that we assess do have at least one policy on deforestation, which is great. And we know that some of that action has been driven because their investors are engaging with them on deforestation and the human rights abuses, which is really great to see. Unfortunately, there are still 1/3 of the companies with the greatest influence on deforestation that haven't set a policy on deforestation that still have a lot of progress to make. And it would be great to see financial institutions that are invested in those companies really pushing for engagement from them.
Pushing for engagement, or I guess if they're really not going to change at that stage, divesting. So because presumably some of those companies just will be resistant to changing.
I think potentially some of them are, but I think with the European Union due diligence legislation that we talked about earlier, and with the Glasgow Declaration on Forests and the Global Biodiversity Framework, the pressures from these companies from all angles are really increasing. And in a way, within a few years, there will be nowhere else for them to go except improve on deforestation.
Emma, can you of the sectors that you outlined as the drivers for deforestation, can you give us a sense for which are the important sectors, where are sort of some of the major problems coming from, and how's that changing over time?
In the Forest 500, we focus on palm oil and soy, as well as beef and leather, timber and pulp and paper, and we assess companies throughout the supply chain. So those that produce those commodities, so they grow them, those that turn them from that crop into, say, palm oil, those that trade them, those that turn them into chocolate bars or ready meals, and then those that sell them. So we assess companies throughout the supply chains. And what we've seen is that companies in palm oil supply chains are actually performing a lot better than companies in other supply chains. So for instance, companies in beef and leather supply chains, soy supply chains are much less likely to have a deforestation policy. They're much less likely to be implementing those policies on the ground. And that is throughout the supply chain. So that includes those producing those commodities through to those that are selling them. So those commodities really do have a lot of progress to make, especially because now beef and soy are the two biggest global drivers of deforestation.
Right. So they become crucial focuses for your work.
Exactly.
And Emma, can you talk about the relationship between your work and the EU regulations that are on the drawing board?
So the incoming EU due diligence legislation, which we're assuming or hoping will come into force in early 2025, I believe, will require companies that are operating in or trading through the European Union, will require them to prove that their commodities and their products are deforestation free. So it's requiring companies to set strong traceability processes to track exactly where that commodity came from, and also then to identify, was there any deforestation throughout that whole supply chain that could link this product to deforestation? And if there is, then that product can't be sold in the European Union or traded through the European Union, or those companies will risk being fined 4% of their annual turnover if they're not compliant with that policy. So although it is focused in the European Union, there are a lot of companies, especially the large international companies that have the greatest influence on deforestation, that are operating in or trading in the European Union. So it has the potential to obviously improve the supply chains of those specific products right through to the regions where they were produced, but also for global supply chain, because for many companies, it's easier to ensure that all of their products are deforestation free than to ensure that the supply chains for a specific subgroup of products are deforestation free. So this EU legislation could be transformative. There are still things that are missing from that legislation, like human rights abuses, which we hope will be introduced eventually.
Yeah, great. And Emma, sort of the impacts that this may have will presumably have benefits across tropical forests throughout the world. Are there particular areas where you see the EU's regulations and the activities of investors maybe having more impact? For example, there's been a lot of attention on the Amazon. Is it there, or is it the forests of Indonesia? You know, the increasingly forests in West Africa are under pressure. Where are the kind of hotspots where these kind of pressures are likely to lead to real change?
In the Forest 500 companies that we assess, so those that have the greatest exposure to the risk of deforestation, they are particularly concentrated in South America, so particularly Brazil, but also, for example, Argentina and others. And then also, as you mentioned, in Southeast Asia, so Indonesia and Malaysia, among others. So this legislation will have a huge impact on the deforestation in those regions, we hope, And especially, we have seen Indonesia and Malaysia make some significant progress on deforestation in the past few years, and we do need other commodities, so that's specifically palm oil related, but other commodities like soy and beef and leather that are produced elsewhere. We really do need to see those supply chains become deforestation free.
Yeah. And final question for you, Emma. Thank you very much for joining us. Are you seeing that businesses and investors are becoming more and more aware of these risks and more and more concerned about deforestation in their supply chain? Is this a kind of one of these issues that's really building in importance?
Absolutely. I think even a few years ago, we were assessing financial institutions and we were having conversations with a few, but in the past few years, that has quadrupled. These financial institutions are really starting to take deforestation seriously. I think as the connection between deforestation and nature loss and climate change has become so evident, that for financial institutions that have net zero targets or nature targets, deforestation is a really useful entry point into those issues. If they make progress on deforestation, they can make significant steps to achieving their other targets. And I think in addition to that, financial institutions are starting to recognize the risks of inaction on deforestation, whether that's reputational, whether that's financial, through companies that they're investing in losing value by continuing to deforest, or, as we've discussed with legislation, incoming compliance risks as well. So we have seen a lot of action in the past few years, and I am very hopeful that 2023 will be that watershed year for action on deforestation, and that those financial institutions will step up even further and continue to act on this issue.
Emma, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Emma Thomson from Global Canopy in the UK, lead for the Forest 500 report. We'll make sure we have the link to that in the chat for our seminar. Thank you very much for joining us, Emma.
Thank you for having me.
Right. So I think that kicks us off very well for the panel discussion. When we saw this Forest 500 research, we wanted to look and see how it applied to New Zealand, and primarily the route that it applies is through New Zealand funds, KiwiSaver, retail investment funds, in particular investing in some of those companies, global companies that are responsible for deforestation. So I would now like to introduce the lead author of Mindful Money's report on deforestation, released over the last couple of days. This is Shannon Barnes. So Shannon is an environmental expert and head of research for Mindful Money. So Shannon, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you.
Shannon, can you talk about how you undertook the research, a bit about the methodology of what you did in order to establish those investment flows?
Yeah, so Mindful Money maintains a list of companies that have involvement in issues of concern, and one of those issues of concern is environmental harm. And in that category, we include companies involved in practices that degrade the environment, like deforestation. So to gather these companies, we used a range of resources, such as the Forest 500 companies, but also data from other NGOs or research or credible media that prove that a company has been involved in deforestation, either through its direct operations or directly through its supply chain. So you would have heard Emma say the Forest 500 contains 350 companies exposed to the risk of deforestation. So we've taken kind of the worst of the worst for our deforestation list, and it's not quite as long, only 24 companies, but these 24 companies are driving the clearing of forests to use the land for commodities like beef, soy, palm oil, and other agricultural resources. So once we had those 24 companies identified, we matched these companies against what companies are held in each of the KiwiSaver funds and managed funds in New Zealand, because that data is publicly available. So we did a matching process. We matched the 24 companies versus what is held in all of New Zealand's funds. And we were able to see which funds were holding any of these companies, either through their direct investment or indirect investment through funds inside of funds. And so through that, we're able to see how much investment in terms of dollar value is held in New Zealand funds.
Cool, that's great. And can you talk about the trends, what you found in terms of that New Zealand investment in these companies that are driving deforestation?
Yeah, absolutely. So once you add up the dollar value held in all the funds across these 24 companies driving deforestation, you get an idea of New Zealand's overall investment in these companies. So we did that with the data over the past year, and we found that the dollar value of investment in these 24 companies driving deforestation across all of New Zealand's funds has increased over time from 38 million in September 2021 to 68 million in September 2022. So that's a quite a big substantial increase. And as a snapshot, in September 2022, there was 40 million of this deforestation investment was in KiwiSaver portfolios. And we found there are in September 2022, there are 137 types of KiwiSaver funds and 140 types of managed funds that contain at least one of these companies. So all in all, global deforestation is spread far and wide throughout New Zealand's investment.
Cool. So our colleague Olive will put the links to the Forest 500 report and the Mindful Money report on New Zealand investment in the chat. Meantime, for those who want to ask a question, then please use the Ask a Question function, and we will soon feed those questions into the discussion. But maybe a last one for you, Shannon. The report highlights those, as you said, the worst of the worst companies. Do you want to give us a profile of a couple of those companies and why they're on the list?
Yeah, so the trends we found were generally similar to what Emma was saying in terms of the industries they operate in, so beef, soy, palm oil, paper and pulp. And we also found some companies that were involved in deforestation through the clearing of land for resources or for mining, and then a number of companies that were involved through their supply chains, so food companies and agri-food businesses. And so the five main companies in KiwiSaver and managed fund portfolios with growing investment include Archer Daniels Midland, Bungie Limited, Glencore, POSCO International, and Astra International. And more information on who those five companies are and how they're linked to deforestation and what areas around the globe are all included in that report as well. So go and have a look at that.
It's interesting that these companies are also perhaps cited for other things. I recall that POSCO was one of their companies cited for links with the Myanmar military, and that was a recent report from Mindful Money, and really highlighted the way that there's close links between some international companies and the military regime and Myanmar. So let's thank you, Shannon. That's great. We'll bring you back into discussion in a minute, but it's my great pleasure to introduce our other panelist, who is Alana Lampitt. So Alana is a partner at Chapman Tripp. She leads on environment and resource management. She's the author of the recent legal opinion, Nature-Related Risks and Impact on Natural Capital. This was prepared for the Aotearoa Circle and published by them. And again, we'll put a link to that report into the chat. So a very warm welcome to you, Alana.
Thanks, Barry.
Could you start off by telling us about the report and its significance?
Sure. So we were asked by the Aotearoa Circle to produce a report which is slightly different to the background of what we've been discussing thus far. So the question that was posed to us is to what extent, if at all, are New Zealand company directors required to take nature-related risks to business into account in their decision making? So that to boil it down is nature-related risks. So these may be deforestation, biodiversity impact, ecosystem impact. And those risks impacting on business as opposed to business impact on those areas. So how are company directors required to take those matters into account? And a lot of this assessment was built off two prior opinions. And I should say I'm the co-author with my amazing colleague, Nicola Swan, in relation to this opinion. But similar opinions have been produced in relation to the way in which climate-related risks are a relevant consideration for directors. And the real purpose of this sort of analysis, and why the wonderful Vicky Watson from the Aotearoa Circle is such a thought leader in this space, is it's really intended to enable New Zealand company directors to stay ahead of the curve, to anticipate where new developments are coming in terms of influencing the nature of their obligations. And where we got to, so the sort of key conclusions of that opinion, is that prudent directors in particular sectors, and those sectors being sectors with dependencies or impacts on natural capital, would be wise to start on the path towards ensuring that they have risk management processes to identify their nature-related dependencies, to assess the foreseeability and the materiality of risks to those dependencies on their businesses, and to make sure that they have risk management strategies in place to manage those risks. And in our view, that provides a number of benefits as well to corporates. So not only does it provide for defences against liability risks in relation to direct duties, but it also ensures that those businesses are in the best place to be resilient to those risks. And also to find opportunities, because there are some really significant opportunities in terms of how businesses can place themselves in a position to avoid or weather the storms of incoming nature-related risks.
Alana, let's dive into a little bit about what those risks are that companies should pay attention to. I think you've said that reputational risk is one of the main risks, and I guess these days, if a company is involved in deforestation through supply chains in another part of the world, then increasingly we live in a global village, and they're going to be found out, and that creates a reputational risk. Can you talk more about that? Because it's linked also to kind of like a social license to operate, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think when we're talking about nature-related risks, there's sort of two aspects of that. One is dependency, so the extent to which the corporate is dependent on an ecosystem service. So some of the examples in that space are, for example, a tourism sector operator who is reliant on ecosystem services that are provided by access to kauri forests in Northland, for example. And as we have a kauri dieback, closure of those forests, a number of tourism businesses were directly impacted by that. So that's sort of the dependency example. Then we get into the impact examples. So impact examples are when a corporate might have an impact on biodiversity, and that has a flow through in terms of reputational risk and impact. And that can, the reputational risk, those transition risks and regulatory risks are likely to be felt much further in advance in many cases than those physical dependency risks. And one of the ways that the opinion develops our understanding of how nature-related risks impact directors' duties is to look at what are the factors that are really driving those reputational risks. So some of those factors are, as we heard from Emma before, a much greater understanding, data and information in relation to supply chains. So there being a lot more transparency about how a corporate's actions can be indirectly linked to higher up the supply chain impacts. And so as that information emerges, it really increases that risk to reputation. But there's also a number of regulatory moves that are also providing that background. So we've already heard about the EU regulation in relation to deforestation, but there's also other EU regulations coming through in relation to corporate sustainability reporting directives, and those will also provide a lot more information that is available that could be relevant to corporates in terms of impacts to their own reputation.
Right. Let's bring Shannon back, and so we can have a panel discussion. I just wanted to feed in a question from the Q&A. So once again, I see some questions in the chat. You can also use the ask a question button on your screen to put a question in there. So I guess this might be for you, Shannon. Reading the report, some companies have zero deforestation policies in place, yet they're still linked to deforestation. So how does that happen?
Yeah, good question. So companies might have a zero deforestation policy in place, but we are still finding that they are linked to deforestation, and that is because they might have issues that happen kind of on the ground. So things like lack of monitoring or enforcement, corruption in a local country, and then also issues along traceability along the supply chain, which can be quite tricky in a large, complex supply chain when the company is based overseas, but the actions of deforestation are happening somewhere else along the ground. So there is a lot of things that can go wrong in terms of trying to trace that the deforestation on the ground. So things like the EU regulation will be really helpful in this sense, because they'll provide a standard of having to, I guess, prove or validate on the ground what is actually happening.
It's interesting, the EU regulation, Alana. We've already seen, in a way, the anti-slavery legislation in different countries, and soon, hopefully, in New Zealand. Putting a more of a regulatory focus on labour rights, now extending that to issues like deforestation, will really ramp up the pressure on companies to not only take these issues to an account, but also to report on them, which doesn't happen at the moment.
I mean, I think it's really interesting to see that transition as it occurs over time. I was practicing in London when the modern slavery legislation first came through, and the development and the expectations have really ramped up as you've seen different jurisdictions pick up on modern slavery due diligence exercises. So you've really seen that transition from what is what was originally a fairly vanilla policy obligation really increase through Europe, back through reforms in the UK. Australia's picked up a more robust approach, and then the approach that has been proposed in New Zealand, which we are waiting to see the response of, is one step further again to provide that further due diligence into supply chains and expectations of obligations to evidence that due diligence as well.
Yeah. We see quite a lot of regulatory action around investment issues happening in the EU through their financial disclosure regime. And obviously New Zealand has now got climate disclosure regulation in place, but not yet regulations affecting other social and environmental issues. Do you think there's a danger that we're kind of being left behind in some of these regulatory actions, and that then may mean that we're out of step with other major markets and other global companies?
I think what we've seen in the context of nature-related risk and how that differs to climate-related risk is it is, in many instances, much more locationally specific and therefore complex. And so the task that is presented to corporates to manage those risks really differs depending on a sectoral approach. So what we've also seen is that the progress towards nature-related disclosures and nature-related risk assessments has ramped up at a rate that is possibly higher than climate as well. So we're already seeing, just later this month, we're going to have the Science-Based Targets initiative in relation to nature-based targets released. We will also have the task force of nature-related financial disclosures coming out for its final draft in September. So those things combined really lead us to a situation where the finance sector and the investment sector is taking a voluntary lead in this space, and corporates might be left behind if they're not picking up on that. Whether or not the regulatory side follows in New Zealand at the same pace is still yet to be seen. Certainly, there's no suggestion that we are making a move towards mandatory nature-based risk disclosures yet. But there is what we're certainly doing, in our opinion, is flagging that the rest of the world is moving towards that direction at pace, and that prudent directives, particularly in exposed sectors, and therefore also funds who are investing in those same exposed sectors, should be making sure that they have processes in place to recognise those risks and manage them going forward.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're absolutely right about that. We that area of reporting on social and environmental impacts is an area that is moving quickly, nature-related as being a good example. And while the XRB is looking at voluntary standards for reporting, it falls short of kind of mandatory framework.
That's right.
We've also got a question from Mari Ledbetter. Mari's a tireless kind of active campaigner on issues affecting West Papua, and has done fantastic work over years to highlight those issues. She says that both POSCO and Astro Ligari have been implicated in deforestation in West Papua, as well as in other parts of the world, highlighted in the Forest 500 report. And I guess from New Zealand's perspective, that's important because of our supply chains, particularly for issues like timber, like kwila, which people use for their outdoor decking, come from Indonesia. And as Mari says, regulations often very lax. A lot of the deforestation is illegal, and protections are minimal. Shannon, when you're sort of, in a way, asking you to put your environmental scientist hat on, you see particular areas that are vulnerable internationally. I know Emma talked a little bit about the Amazon. For New Zealand, we should be paying attention to our Pacific neighbourhood. Is that your view as well?
Yeah, definitely. Any kind of nature or forest ecosystem is certainly important for anything we do in New Zealand. So as long as we can keep an eye out around the world, because it does affect us. Yeah.
And I think particularly kind of areas in the Pacific are kind of, in a way, it's part of New Zealand's responsibility to make sure that we're well aware of those issues. Again, Shannon, we have a question about is there any guidance on which KiwiSaver funds do not invest in deforestation, and are there any plans to approach funds to get them to divest from companies or funds linked to deforestation and human rights abuses? Do you want to have a go on that one?
Yeah, so you can check KiwiSaver funds on our website. We have an open source free for all users to go onto our website, and you can check any KiwiSaver managed fund that you type in, and it'll bring up a list of companies that might be involved in issues of concern. So that's one way to check if companies are involved in the environmental harm category that I was talking about earlier. And then also we do have plans to engage with fund managers about divestment or other strategies. We've included in our report strategies about engagement with these companies that are causing deforestation. We've included information about divestment or reinvestment in companies that are actually doing sustainable work in ecosystems, and then also putting in strong policies in place for lending and investments to companies that might be driving deforestation. So we've got further guidance in our report there for funds. and fund
And
managers.
just on that, we have sent the report yesterday to all fund managers in New Zealand. If you see the video and haven't seen the report, please do get in touch with us on the website and in the chat here. We will follow up with fund managers as we have done in the past with issues like investment in companies producing nuclear weapons, or investment in companies linked to the Putin regime, or linked to Myanmar military. So these are issues that New Zealand investors really don't want their money to be invested in. So back to you, Alana. The work on nature-based risk. What do you think the state of knowledge and understanding from directors is on this? Do you think this is coming as somewhat of a revelation? Is there a growing sense of understanding about these issues?
I think it's fair to say that we're at the stage of growing understanding, and in a number of these sectors, particularly domestic sectors, where we're not talking about sort of large upstream supply chain issues. These are issues that are well understood because they really go to the bottom line. So a number of corporates already have good data in relation to nature dependencies, and the developing use of that data and utilising the tools that are already out there for nature-related disclosures is something that we particularly picked up on in the opinion. So we are very conscious that directors have an increasing load and expectation with respect to duties. So what we tried to do in the opinion was really boil down the actions that directors can take to get started in this sector. So what we did was pull out other resources that are particularly useful from the climate-related financial risks that can also be applied to nature-related risks. We also pulled out 6 specific questions that we suggest directors utilise to get going, to understand what those risks are and to consider the materiality and the foreseeability of those risks, and therefore to place themselves in a good position to manage those risks.
And I note that your colleagues in Chapman Tripp have also produced a very useful toolbox for directors on those climate-related risks. I think that's been a hugely important resource, and I'm sure this legal opinion on nature-based risks will be as well. Are there plans from the Institute of Directors to maybe do some educational work with directors that you're aware of?
Well, what I suggest is following the Aotearoa Circle. Vicky Watson has an excellent workshop series of willing participants and corporates who have really committed to the sector to go through trial-based procedures to consider how you take into account and how you build nature-related risks into organisations. So it's some of New Zealand's largest corporates have already committed to that process. So it's something that's certainly underway.
Okay, so that references to Vicky Watson, who's the CEO of Aotearoa Circle. They're doing great work on these issues. So maybe we've got time for just 1 or 2 more questions. One of the things, Alana, that sometimes comes up is that issue around risks being risks to the company from the environment, from nature, rather than more of an impact approach, which is looking at the impacts of the company on the environment. So in a way, it sometimes looks at as if these risk analyses are more worried about the financial returns than they are actually on whether the forests are being destroyed and the climate's being polluted, etc. From your perspective, do you see a coming together of those 2 issues? Because obviously, from members of the public, they're just as worried about the risks in the real world as they are their financial risks.
At the risk of diving into the lingo from the sector, the way this is often discussed is single versus double materiality. So single materiality being those impacts of degradation to ecosystems on a corporate, double materiality being both that and also the impacts of the corporate on ecosystems and biodiversity. We're certainly seeing that where we've already evolved directors' duties to is to take into account single materiality where that is both foreseeable and material to business. And we have put a marker out there to see how double materiality develops. It's certainly something that's worth watching. We haven't reached the final view that it's there yet for directors' duties, but we are certainly putting the marker out there that corporates need to be aware of it. But I think even stepping back from distinctions between double and single materiality, impacts have an impact, or impacts of a corporate impact the risk to reputation, and that is something that all corporates hold dear. As we're entering into a world where consumers are much more focused on the brand reputation of corporates and the authenticity of claims and claims to sustainability credentials, we are absolutely in that space where reputation is important.
Great. And Shannon, final question to you on your research around these issues. Obviously, this work on deforestation is sort of brings this issue more to light to companies and to investors. What else have you got on your radar that you're looking at and concerned about in terms of research?
Yeah, in the environmental space, anything that involves degradation to the environment, so that is deforestation or the use of, say, highly hazardous pesticides or extracting resources from the earth that leave great big environmental degradation and pollution. And then in the other spheres, we're also looking at the use of fossil fuels and how that is harming the climate and the environment as well.
Yeah, so just to pick up on that, the report on fossil fuels is in a way taking investment in fossil fuels and unpacking it and saying there's a subset of fossil fuel companies that are on a 1.5 degree transition pathway, but there's others that are still expanding their exploration and production against the advice and guidance of the International Energy Agency. So we're going to be publishing a report soon, within a couple of weeks, about those distinctions and which companies fall into which camp. So we will do a future seminar on those issues as well. So thank you very much to both of you, and Emma in her absence. Thank you, Alana, for your great work on the legal opinion and your ongoing work on climate change and nature-related issues. Thanks for coming on the seminar, and thanks to you, Shannon, for your terrific work and for this report. So I just wanted to kind of, in a way, finish on a little bit of a personal note. So I've spent my career working for organizations like WWF and Oxfam, and I've traveled to many of the most pristine but threatened forests in the world, and I've seen been to a number of the international meetings where there have been numerous pledges to end illegal and unsustainable and unjust deforestation, but so far with very little result. So what we're seeing now is the start of some perhaps some market-based sanctions on companies driving deforestation and their financiers, particularly using the power of consumers. So this is absolutely urgent. We're in a climate emergency, and deforestation is one of the biggest drivers of emissions. So taking action is not just about what somebody else does, whether it's a government or whether it's a company or an investor. It should involve all of us. And as we've seen from this Mindful Money report, it's our money that's contributing to deforestation, and we can use our voice in order to ensure that we don't contribute to the problem. So thanks to all for attending this seminar. I wanted to thank our generous sponsors. The sponsors for this series include Alfinity, Medical Assurance Society, MAS, Mercer, and New Zealand Green Investment Finance, and Go Green Investment Finance for just having received another $300 million from the New Zealand government to bolster their equity. It's great news. Also sponsorship from Chapman Tripp. So thank you very much, Alana, to you and your colleagues, to Booster, Harbour, and Trustees Executors, and with contributions from Pathfinder and Pathfunds. So thank you all very much for coming, and we'll be back on air with the next seminar coming up soon. I hope you all stay active. I hope you invest mindfully. Mā te wā.